Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're located, and welcome to today's webinar, BBS Using Data to Improve the Process. So I'm going to get us started with a couple housekeeping items, and then I will turn it over to our presenter. So first of all, everybody's in listen-only mode, so you are muted at the time being. So if you have any questions, you will type those into the questions pane in your control panel located down at the bottom of your control panel there. So we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of this session. So if you have any questions, we'll go through those at that time. And this session is being recorded and will be sent out to all attendees after the webinar has concluded within a couple days. So you will get that in your email inboxes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Tim Boyer, who is the Senior VP of Technology for DEKRA North America Consulting.
Thanks, Drew, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to some of our friends in the Middle East. So thanks for joining us today. What we're going to do is we're going to start talking about some of the data that can be used to improve BBS processes. And just to give a little background on some of the talk that we're going to be doing today is we've recently had a really rare opportunity in our technology group to import just massive amounts of data spanning 20 plus years, millions of observations, and many organizations. So that gave us a chance to sit down and really take a look at what some metrics mean and how important they are. And probably even more important than that, the technology has changed. So, you know, the things that we used to be able to not even think about collecting, we now have new ways to do it because of new machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence. And honestly, it's going to give us a chance at a whole new level of leading metrics that we could be using to improve our processes. So, you know, a lot of what we're going to look at today are going to be new things that might have not even been possible several years ago. Sorry. You know, the thing I want to cover a little bit about, this is not a talk about behavior-based safety systems, but I need to include a little bit about implementations in the background to talk about how some of these new metrics can affect what it is that we're doing. So let's just go back to the basics of a solid behavior-based safety implementation. You know, the reason it works, and we know it works, it's been proven to be effective over the years, is it's based on real science. You know, so people come in when they start an implementation, they either use outside help, try to do it on their own, but you're focused on the science behind behavior-based safety. So we have the ABCs, you know, the antecedents, the behaviors and the consequences from those behaviors. And then it was all based, you know, on the original go around with operative conditioning. So we're talking about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. There's the science behind it. So what happens is usually you get your team together, you have a steering committee, somebody in management. You look at all the incidents, and you identify those behaviors or risk exposures that you need to improve on. Then you target for improvement. You develop checklists. You train your observers to conduct observation and provide feedback. And then all this data comes in, and your steering committee is supposed to review the results for trends and then remove barriers to safe work. So again, it's solid. It works when it's done right. It's based on real science. So based on the traditional metrics, right, what we've measured in the past, you know, we looked at things like observation goals, which are important. You know, we're looking at, are the participants doing the required number of observations? Or if you're using a volunteer system, are they completing desired amounts? I mean, if you're not looking, right, they're not going to find it. So again, it's a really solid metric. Participation rate. What percent of your people that are trained to do observations are actually doing them? If you have a low participation rate, you're not finding things, right? Contact rate. So what percent of the work population is actually being observed and having the chance to have feedback provided? And then percent safe, right? This is a great thing. When we first start a program, we're really trying to track, have we affected those behaviors or how people approach those risks in their workplace? They're really good traditional measures. This is what it would look like. This is what I would consider most people think in a very good dashboard that would be able to do this. So, over the course of time, you can measure the percent safe and participation, contact rate, how many active observers do you have, how many people were observed, and other things, percent safe over time, and then, even the top 5 risk exposures. These are all really good things, and they're really good things to watch, but they can lead to some problems. So what I guess we want to lead into is traditional metrics are really good, but what we have found out looking at the data is there's a lot of areas for improvement. And what we found out is people's systems programs can become stale over time and improvement stalls. And we really looked at why does this happen? And again, the amount of data we had gave us some really interesting opportunities to find some new insights. So, why do things shift? Well, again, a lot of it becomes somewhere along the line you can shift and we start reinforcing the wrong behaviors, right? We start pushing quality over quantity over quality. So what becomes from the planning stages and the training and everything is, hey, this would be great if we could get people to do 3 observations to really collect quality data, quickly turns into, I just got to get 3 observations done, right? Probably the biggest thing I think we shift from science is just we quit providing feedback to our observers. So if we're just pushing quality or quantity over quality, are we tracking anything with feedback? So what's the motivation of the observer to do a good observation? And then what we found is they really are the quality control checkpoint. So, what we've seen in a lot of systems, you train people, you get them excited, they start filling out observations, and then you'd be shocked how often we hear about companies that have 10,000 observations in a box on somebody's desk and nobody acted. How are they going to feel about that, right? Why should they do anything? The other thing that I think science, we all learned it at the beginning, but it might have been a bit hard to implement. Research proves that maintaining multiple feedback channels leads to program sustainability. Again, if you want to look at positive reinforcement, is that even happening, right? So one of the things that we found out is there's a real lack of feedback from any level, and especially from, say, the steering committee to the observers. They're not telling them they're doing a good job. So over time, what happens? The observers can start thinking that, hey, these guys don't care. The only thing they care about is I get my 10 done, and they don't worry about putting the effort into it. So we lose the science. And the other thing that's really amazing is, are the observers providing feedback to the peers they observe? Shockingly, over time, what we find out is people are not giving any feedback, right? We start moving into pencil whipping. So you got to go back and kind of remember the science. And that's what we wanted to do, looking at new leading indicators and things that might affect sustainability. And what we see is, it's pretty easy to identify pencil whipping. It's pretty easy to identify. People mark the easy stuff, right? If I've got to go out and, I've got to get 8 done to hit my goals or earn a certificate or whatever, I'm going to go out and do 8. And what you're going to see is a lot of stuff that hard hats, the hearing protection, it's easy. It's on the top of the list, right? They generally don't have to provide feedback. So if you don't find a metric to measure what's happening there, you're going to start sliding and shifting into non-sustainable programs. Another thing that we really see with traditional metrics, and we call it frequency illusion. We hear a lot of people come back, we have conversations, they go, geez, we have done 10,000 observations, so we have to be safe. Yeah, what if you do 10,000 observations and they never find a single at risk, and it has no correlation with your injury rates? So we do see a lot of people focus on get it done, get it done, get it done, and not what they're finding or the quality of it. Another thing that we really found, and we'll show some pretty unique examples of, is risk change over time. Has your checklist. Not many people I know over 20 years haven't introduced a new process, a new piece of equipment, even a new employee. We talk about this exposure pool that continues to evolve and change as a company. But most people don't update their checklist or talk to their people or provide feedback on that moving exposure. And probably the biggest thing that we have an opportunity to measure now is observation quality, and we'll spend time talking about this. But the quality of your observations drives the quality of your program, period. You may have started with great intentions, but where's it at now? What did it evolve it to? So, can your current system point out observations that might be pencil whipped, or even observers that might need additional coaching? And we'll visit about some of those new metrics. So we're going to talk a bit about some new quality-based metrics. And again, these are things that we have found through data, and we're able to do some actual research in the background to see how they play an impact on observation quality. And the first part's field of view. We'll talk about it. Observation quality, measuring it, right? Using empirical data to define it to help make sure people understand what it is you want out of your system. Type of feedback is, if any, this is the biggest gap we see. People quit providing feedback. A lot of the systems where we've talked to people and they feel like their system's stale, or maybe it's ran its course, it's because they forgot the science behind behavior-based safety. Another thing that we're going to talk about is exposure trends over time, and I see this one a lot, where people will be at 87% safe, and I'll just use an example of an exposure of people wearing seatbelts on powered industrial trucks or equipment, forklifts, but it stays that way for 2 years. What are you doing? So people have a habit of, it evolves into, you look at these reports monthly. They don't look for the trends over time. So if you're not going to affect anything or put an action item in place to change it, why are you even looking at it? It was 80% last year, it's going to be 80% next year. Another interesting role comparison that affects quality is the role comparisons, that we'll talk about that. You have people out there doing coaching sessions. Are they seeing anything different, right, than the observers? Are the people on your steering committee the baseline that you should be looking at? And we'll look at that as a metric. And then clean sheets, we'll spend a little more time on. We have some research that we can talk about, and it's really a lagging indicator from all the other leading indicators, but it can actually be a huge barometer in the overall health of your systems. So to start off with, we're going to talk about field of view. So what's a field of view? Remember when you got everybody together and you either worked with a consultant or you did it on your own, and you went through and you built a checklist, right? That checklist is really, it's your exposure pool. It's where people can get hurt. But are your observers seeing those? And what we find is, due to other program systems or changes in the system, people just start looking at specific things. And a lot of times they're only looking at the easy exposure. So this chart is just really comparing a client's data, where we had an individual observer that over the course of the year made 112 observations. So I took out the data points to kind of protect who the client might be, but you can see they're very specifically focused on certain areas. That means there's areas of risk they're not even looking at. Cognitive bias, pencil whipping. It's just something we need to be aware of. So the chart next to it is I have location. It's actually the department that this individual was a member of. So if you take a look, that whole department did over 6,000 observations. They see in the exact same thing, right? So you get into some social thinking areas. Are you monitoring this? Are you just paying attention to X amount of at risk, but not what that at risk is? And this is very pervasive in mature systems. And I'm going to show a quick video of some data I pulled together from an implementation that's 10 years old. Now these people had actually implemented 5 years earlier, but I didn't have the data from where they were when they implemented in 99, but I had the data from 2005 on. So I'm going to play this video and then just keep an eye on what happens over time. As you can see, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, what's changed, right? 2010, and then people tell us their systems are stale. So what have they done? What have you done to measure the quality that this doesn't happen? You know, if you take a look at all of those are risks. You know, we talk a lot in the industry today about SIF. A lot of those are laying in these other areas, right? Those are areas that just aren't being looked at. Now you saw a little bit of a shift in 15. Actually, what they tried to do was break out the checklist to get away from this. But honestly, it just went right back into PPE and, you know, people looking at hard hats. So you'd be shocked at how long people have been doing this over the years. They're still getting their observations done, right? They're still going through the process, but they haven't updated anything, and they're just kind of basically mailing in their observations. So one of the things that we've done is we've looked at this as being a very important metric. So you can measure this. I mean, you can actually take a look at it. So, you know, one of the new metrics or things that we've been looking at is how do you, how do you actually re-involve the observer in the process? So this is just a report, and all it's showing is if when an individual logs in, we're showing them their field of view. They're missing everything, you know, about 180 degrees worth of risk. And even the company can take a view. These are things that you can take a comparison. You can see what that guy's seeing. You can see what the company's not seeing, and change your checklist. Have conversations with people. Provide feedback that, you know, you need to look up. You know, you need to look behind you. You need to look at these certain risks. So the field of view can be measured as a percentage. It's a new leading indicator that we've pulled into some of our reporting. And I think it's one of the more important things about reinvigorating a program or a system. Sorry, another thing that we're really looking at, and it's obviously that's came out, is observation quality. How often do you measure your observation quality, and what percent of observations and observers are you measuring? So, you know, observation quality is a leading indicator. You can use it to provide feedback to the observer. Are they having conversations? There's another one. You'd be able to just go down and take a percent of your observers and the conversation, the number of times they have conversations. If you have people that aren't having conversations, you use that as a leading indicator of people that need to have coaching. So now you start integrating a coaching metric. But are people looking at all the risk, right? We talked about that field of view. People, locations, groupthink, people look at the same specific things. You know, you need to provide feedback so they look at something else. Now, I've already mentioned we can look at who needs additional coaching, but what it does do is it requires review of observations, and it requires a reviewer to give feedback. This is how you can do a course correction before things slide off into a program becoming stale. And I'm just showing some examples that we use in our systems. But one of the new metrics things that we measure is we've actually added areas that we measure the comments, right? So you could actually, have the observer provide a comment. In this case, he said, hey, an employee used a new mobile lift to bring load up and down as needed. Very nice improvement, along with the checklist. And then the reviewer came back, you had that first feedback channel from the observer to the peer he was observing. And now the reviewer says, hey, great job on getting the employees done in observation. R plus, right? You're reinforcing what it is you want that observer to do. And then you can actually measure these observation qualities over time. So we're something as simple as a star ranking. The whoever did the review gave the guy 4 points. You can measure that over a whole organization. Is it improving, right? Are you talking to people? And then a new thing we've also added too that we think is a meaningful metric is we provide that feedback to the observer. It's awfully easy to look at something and never tell the guy he needs to change or thank him, right? Positive reinforcement. So another thing you might want to consider is personal dashboards where you actually provide that positive feedback back to the employee. And as long as we're sticking on feedback, one of the biggest things that we found, honestly, that's missing in most systems, if I went and asked somebody, hey, you guys remember the training, you've read the books, you understand the ABCs, you understand the R plus, the R minus, what kind of feedback are you giving? And 9 times out of 10, they'll look at you funny, you're saying it's all positive, but nobody's ever measured it. One of the new opportunities that's came along with the growth of machine learning and artificial intelligence is we could take that old data and those comments and go back to the science, and we could actually shove their comments and the things that we've collected into a algorithm, natural language processing, and we can measure it empirically. So it's interesting what happens is, number one, the first thing we find is people are giving no feedback. Nowhere is it measured, nowhere is it collected. When they do give feedback, and we know we're supposed to be doing positive or corrective, most of the time that we've looked at it, it's neutral. There's nothing, right? They're not putting any improvement items. They're not coaching the guy through. Generally, it's very low positive, and it's more negative. But when you go back and you understand all the science behind it, nowhere does it say that 71% of the time you should be giving neutral feedback. And it's kind of interesting. This is real data. When you make people aware of it, you can actually see the trends changing over time. So you can see where, they were basically giving 12% positive feedback, the orange line. But when you're made aware of it and you coach people and you talk to people, watch what happens to that trend line. It starts trending up into a positive improvement area. So again, we're just A, measuring people are talking and providing feedback, and then B, reminding people of the type of feedback that needs to be given. We measured this one. This is the feedback provided from the observer to the peer. We also can measure from the coach reviewer to the person doing the observations. So again, it's science. Another thing that people, I think in most systems, the way it's set up is we don't do a good job of tracking things over time and whether or not they trend and whether or not we're doing anything about it. So back to the seatbelt example. Make sure that people are looking at their training information over time. If something's trended 100% safe, there's no more injuries associated with it, it's probably time to change your focus elsewhere. But if something is staying the same in a 95, 93, 87% area, do you know what your trend line is? And then on top of that, are you tracking action items, which is another leading indicator that a lot of good systems has been tracking forever. Generally, they're not in the same system as behavior-based safety, though. So, here's a case on an exposure. They've measured it 3,783 times. There is a lot of areas. This is a SIP potential, but they've only put in 9 corrective actions. You'd think that might be a little higher, but at most systems we see, they do a lot of observations and there's no corrective action. So again, make sure you have the capacity to look at things over time and use some statistics. Don't look at month to month to month. These things happen over time, and we have new opportunities to do a better job of those reports. Role comparison I talked about. This is one of the more interesting things we pulled out. So what are your different participants seeing when they're out there doing observation? Can you even identify a center line for improvement? If your coaches are seeing more risk than your observers, that's important to know, right? If everyone's seeing 100% safe and you're still having injuries, it might be time to refresh your program. So you can take a look. These are things that you can measure. You have observers that are running 96% safe all the time, and coaches are running 97% safe. You take a look at clean sheets. The coaches are having more clean sheets than what the observers are. But the reviewer in a lot of systems is the most trained employee. He goes out there and sees 92% safe, a lot less on the clean sheet side. And then even the quality of the observations are different. So again, make sure you're measuring this. These are all leading indicators. If you just have a blob of things and you're not taking time to identify these places that might need improvements, then I think that's where programs can get stale. And also the newer technology makes it a lot easier to find these. I talked about clean sheets, and I'm going to spend a little more time on this one. So I saved clean sheets for last because we've identified it that it's an outcome of all the other metrics. But what is a clean sheet? I'd better explain that. So clean sheets are observations where the observer only marks safe on any checklist. And on a 1-each basis, hey, I get it. There are days I can go out and totally possible that I'm not going to find anything at risk or everybody doing everything right. The problem is when you look at it on a larger scale, it gets a little harder to believe that the majority of the observers never see an at-risk exposure, say over the course of a year. So what we did is we looked at a lot of historic data, and again, we pulled in millions of observations. And it's striking that in most of the mature processes, so people that have been doing behavior-based safety for over 5 years, they average 90% clean sheets. So just to think about it, that means that 90% of your people walk into your workplace and never identify a risk over the course of a year. That's a pretty good leading indicator that you might need to do a revitalization. And what's that look like? So what I did is we did some statistics, and we just took a look at this chart. Shows the number of observers with the percent clean sheet. So you can see in this data that we gathered from several companies, but observers, this vast majority of the activity, when you're out there looking, right, or supposedly looking for risk, they're not seeing anything. And even the numbers where they see the occasional risk kind of bubble in there, but it's a good representation of you're not seeing things. So does that make a difference, right? Everybody thinks, hey, we've been doing this for years. Shouldn't our clean sheets, shouldn't we be seeing less at risk? I guess if your risk never changes, maybe, but you've got to come back and compare this. Are you not having any more injuries? When you finally develop that completely injury-free workplace, let us know, right? Because I think a lot of us could learn from that. But one thing we found is we took a deeper look at our data and found that when companies first implement a behavior-based safety process, the average clean sheets is around 55%. That means that they are engaged, they're finding things, but over time the average trends up to 88%, and honestly it trends up there quickly. So I've seen it in probably the majority of the companies that in less than 6 months you're at 88 to 99%. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. On the front end of your system, management and frontline workers are all engaged. They've got high energy levels. Steering committees looked into the incidents. They're looking for that. They've identified where they can make an impact. You get a checklist. The observers are trained how to conduct an observation. But over time, and usually about 6 months, the focus, if you're not looking at these other quality factors, quickly can become more about the system and less about the science. So, you have employee turnover. Who's training them? Are they going to be as enthused about it as the first group? So the focus shifts to just completing it. And I always liken this a bit like the whisper game. I was a Cub Scout in the U.S. growing up, and we had a game where you sit around the fireplace and you'd whisper something in the person's next to your ear, and then everybody completes it all the way around the circle. And when you get to the end, it is not the same thing. And I really think that's what happens to our behavioral systems over time. We start with really good intentions and really good systems, and 5 years later, it is not the same program that you started with. There's no feedback, right? Nobody's talking to each other. So clean sheets is a leading indicator. I wanted to test this since we had all this data come in. So what we wanted to do is to test if an upward trend in clean sheets actually affect a system. So we looked at a recent systems revamp completed by one of our clients, and this is not a small client. It was a large client with a lot of locations. They work about 6 million hours a year, and the key on this is they had just came off their lowest TRR, total recordable incident rate, in their company's history, right? So this is a very well operating company, very mature behavior-based safety process. Actually, they went through a merger a couple of years before this, and they were trying to get to one system. But that also gave us a chance to take a look at how that impacted the system. So remarkably, both systems were running about 90% clean sheets. So they got together, they basically restarted. They put together a new steering team. They went back and looked at all the incidents again. They trained all the employees on the new process, not just the observers, even though they might only had certain people doing observations. then after engaging all the employees in the new process, statistically, we saw an immediate drop in clean sheets. So what they're doing is they're going back to that center line of what the new system looks like. People are engaged again. People are remembering the science. They're providing feedback, and actually, this company is using some of these new metrics that I'm talking about, and we're paying attention to clean sheets and the individual employees that have it. They know where they need to put their emphasis. So the outcome of this, what does it mean? I mean, is it just another exercise and futility? Again, you got to remember that this company was at the best rate they've ever had and already industry leading, right? So we have them in a benchmarking group that this was the best of the best of the best. Just by changing this and changing how the metrics that they were looking at, and honestly retraining people and coming up with new metrics. They're not just going through the processes anymore. Yeah, we're doing observations. They had an additional 27% reductions in injuries over their best year. So, if you take a look at this chart, you're taking a look at a cluster of clean sheets and where it relates to injuries, and then the post revamp and the number of clean sheets and where their injuries are at. And we ran this through a regressive analytics, and there's a positive correlation. So we could actually tell you that the less clean sheets you have is a predictive indicator of your incident rates. So something to think about. It's new metrics. This stuff was not available before unless you had a statistician on staff. But the one thing I want to point out here is you don't do this in a vacuum, right? That's why the clean sheets is not just a standalone metric. You can't just send out an email and say, hey, everybody, lower your clean sheets. You're just going to drive another form of pencil whipping. So you really need to look at those other leading indicators we discussed and be able to tie those into it. So it's just an interesting thing that I think the other things we talked about are why you have high levels of clean sheets. So I want to get some clothing thoughts and see if we can answer some questions. But I'm not saying traditional metrics are not important. Traditional metrics are hugely important, but I think they're mainly set up on implementation, and they're mainly set up to make sure that we have successful implementations. You have to measure these things, or people are going to go out there and do it. But I think what they do is I think you always start with a system with good science. And I think a lot of consultants even feel this way. We hand you a very good solution, but what makes it sustainable? And I think these new metrics are what makes a system sustainable. So don't give up on the traditional ones. Employee engagement can change over time. We got to remember that, and you need to find a way in these new metrics to measure employee engagement. If people don't care, they're going to shift into these clean sheets rather quickly and just mail them in. And there's new metrics out there that can help you focus on engagement. But to get to those new metrics, you got to go back to the science. So even tweaking the checklist is not going to help if you're not going back to positive reinforcement and having conversations. We see a lot of companies that the only time they put any effort into any text is when there's been an at-risk behavior. Well, if you think about that in a company that's running 98% safe, you're missing 98% of the opportunities to provide feedback to those observers and keep you moving. Remember the science. I'm not sitting here trying to talk about it, but you can't separate the science for behavior-based safety from the system you applied to it. So, if you need to go back and revisit what it is you're trying to do, you need to. Don't blame behavior-based safety. There's a lot of recent research going around. You hear some buzz, people saying, hey, it's ran its course. There is research that proves that it is the most effective way to lower injuries. We just have to stay true to the science of it and not let it shift into something else. And then make sure you focus your metrics on sustainability. Even if you don't use the set we bring, think about what can we do to keep up that initial, growth or that initial drop in the injury rates we have to do. And it's not easy. I'll tell you, all of these require a little bit more work, but you've already done a lot of work. Don't throw it away. And I guess I got through that a little quicker. I meant to speak much slower. So, Drew, I'm going to let you go ahead and bring out any questions, and I'll see if I can possibly answer them.
Sure, we got a couple here. First of all, Tim, on the field of view video, there was many behaviors 30 plus. In your point of view, is this too many critical behaviors that observers should be focusing on, i.e., using Pareto's principle, the critical few are resulting in most of our incidents accidents?
Yeah, and I did not bring in a Pareto chart, and I should have. So the answer is yes. There's no targets. There's nothing focused there, and I don't know of any consulting theory out there that says put 40 things on a list. What's the guy really going to pay attention to, right? So there's no focus. If you have that many, how the heck are you going to provide feedback or understand what's important? So, I know some other processes that have a leading indicator of how often do you change your checklist. Yeah, that could lead to problems too. I think there's growth in that area, but it's a good question. And yeah, I would much rather target things. That means you're paying attention to your outcomes and what your injuries are, right? It should be 12 or 13. That just shows what happens when you put your system on cruise control.
We've got another one here. It says, how can we get these analysis graphs from the DEKRA application?
So most of these are there. I'm going to tell you there's a few of them that are in the works, right? Because we're still learning as we go. Talk to your customer service rep. Number one, we just have to turn certain things on. So the clean sheets, I led with this graph. We're adding this one. But right now we have this list that you can take a look at of your observers today. You can set a year, you can run it. And to anonymize it, I didn't show any of that data. This data exists in the system today. This system exists in the system today where we're actually doing the exposure over time, and we're embedding the trend lines and the machine learning into the page. The type of feedback provided, to have access to this one in the system, you have to be collecting feedback, right? We go back to systems that don't do it. So reach out to us, reach out to, if you're working with this, and we can do this. We can help turn these things on. But again, it's not a panacea. When we talked about mailing it in, if your people don't know to provide feedback, this chart's not going to show you anything instantly.
Yeah, we can definitely reach out to anybody who has questions about how to get those up and running after the presentation as well. So just reach out to us and we can help you out. We got a couple more questions here. Isn't the bump, bruise, and bleed section going to have about 80% of the injuries, eyes on task, etc.?
Yeah, it can when you're taking a look at those. But again, what are you doing? If it's 80%, has it always been 80%, right? And also, I think there's opportunities in their SIFs, because if people aren't having conversations, you're not finding out why these things happen. So yeah, you're right. I mean, the bump, bruise, so you could always do, you could take a look at line of fire, but do the people still understand that? It's back to what we talked about. When's the last time they were trained on what that means? And it's not just, a word on a piece of paper. Tim Ludwig did some interesting, or Dr. Tim Ludwig research where the company where they actually changed up the checklist, and then 3 months later, people were still entering things into the database for an old checklist. I mean, you talk about cognitive bias and mental, pencil whipping. We got to get back to the science and remind them about those things.
Okay, we got another one here. It says, does this new BBS software system have global benchmarking capabilities so far as what other organizations are seeing? If so, is it industry specific? I'd expect that critical behaviors in, say, oil and gas are pretty similar.
That's something that we need to work out with clients, and in this day and age of data security, we have a lot of people that don't want to share data. So I'll tell you, the data doesn't care, and we know who's who. We want to be able to build that in. To me, that's extremely important, because I think what you can find from that is it validates a lot of what we were saying with how these leading indicators, these new indicators, can make a difference. So that's kind of a separate conversation, right? We're talking more about what we're seeing. That's something we'd love to talk to more people about, because those are the fine-tuning things that make these systems work and stay sustainable. So it's not a great answer. The data can do it. We just have to work out systems that will actually allow that to happen.
All right, we have a couple questions about the presentation. So this presentation is being recorded and will be sent out to everybody who registered for the webinar as well. So just a reminder that will be sent out in the next couple of days, and we can get you any materials you need as well. So just reach out to me and we can get you the presentation. So if there are no other questions, I think we can wrap up. We have a couple more coming in here, Sam. When trying to improve your clean sheet percentage, how do you set a realistic goal percentage?
You know, and I think that's going to come back in. We're still fine tuning it. So what I would do is I'd go back and look at when you started your program, right? When did you initiate it? When were the people most engaged and the most in tune with what that initial program looked like? And I'd set that as a benchmark, right? And I'd set that as a benchmark for your people. So, you know, you can use our data, and our data is based on a lot of information, right? So that 58% might be something, it might change, but honestly, I'd go back if you can and take a look at your original data. That nobody's going to be any more engaged than they were when you put all the focus in your organization on making behavior-based safety work. And to me, that's the target you should be shooting at.
All right, it looks like that's it for our questions. With that being said, again, presentation will be sent out. It has been recorded. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out. We will have contact information sent out with the recording as well for follow-up. And thank you again for attending. So if there's no other questions, that'll be it.
Thanks, everyone, and hopefully you got something out of this. Honestly, this kind of presentation to me is more about getting you guys to think and generate questions as much as answers. So I appreciate your time.